appreciate you here, ready, willing, and able to get started early, so we're happy about that. Thank you. I do have to ask you those questions. Were you all able to follow my instructions and refrain from discussing this case with anyone since we left here on Friday? Yes. Everyone said yes or nodded affirmatively. Were you also able to follow the instructions and refrain from doing any independent research or investigation into this case? Yes. Everyone said yes or nodded affirmatively. Did anyone happen to see, hear, or read anything about this case since we left on Friday? Everyone said no or shook their heads. Thank you. Mr. Brennan, your next witness, please. Or Mr. Lally.
Thank you. Your Honor, the Commonwealth will call Nicholas Bradford to stand.
Face the clerk. Raise your right hand, please, sir. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you shall give to the court and the jury in the matter now pending shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Lally, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling your last name for the court?
Yep, my name is Nick Bradford, Bradford.
What do you do for work, sir?
I'm a DNA expert for Bodhi Technology
And where is Bodhi Technology located?
in Lorton, Virginia.
And where did you go to school, sir?
I went to school at Mercyhurst College in Erie, Pennsylvania for a bachelor in forensic biology and a master's in forensic molecular biology from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C.
And following your education, where did you go to work?
I started at Bodhi in about 2009.
And so did you work at Bodhi prior to your graduation?
Yes.
And how long have you worked there at Bodhi?
Since then, I spent 2 years at the Pennsylvania State Police at about 2021.
And when you joined Bodhi Technologies, what was your position and title that you were initially hired for?
I was initially a DNA technician.
And when did you become an analyst?
In 2014.
And what is the difference between a technician and an analyst?
The technicians operate the robotic equipment in the labs and assist with paperwork and various reagent duties and things like that.
And what does an analyst do?
An analyst analyzes the DNA evidence that's submitted from various police agencies from around the country. We come to court to testify and do statistical analysis of any comparisons that we might do.
Now, if you could, sir, please describe for the jury the training that you underwent initially as a technician.
As a technician, it was probably a few, maybe 2 or 3 month training process that involved various reading of the manuals for the robotics and various written and verbal exams.
Now, is there a continuing educational component at Bodhi?
Yes, for DNA analysts, we have proficiency testing twice a year. We have to do a certain number of hours of continuing education, so that would be things like conferences, things like that. And we have to do scientific literature reviews, so we have to keep up with the scientific articles 4 times a year.
Now, if you could just expound a little as far as what exactly does that continuing educational component consist of, as far as the conferences and scientific literature review? What specific areas are you reviewing and going to conferences on?
Yes, so that would be areas specific to forensic DNA testing.
Now, how many analysts work at Bodhi?
Somewhere between 60 and 75, maybe.
If you could, please describe for the jury what kind of lab Bodhi is.
So Bodhi is a private DNA lab, and we take casework from various police agencies across the country, and we also have groups that work on international cases and things like that.
Now, you mentioned some of your work, bless you, is submitted from law enforcement agencies around the country. Is that the entirety of the work, or where does some of the other pieces come from?
Yeah, so like I said, some of it is international, and then we also do some research work as well.
Now, what type of analysis do you currently perform at Bodhi?
So I am part of the customized casework group. So we take generally one-off cases or smaller, more complex cases, and then we work through those.
Now, specifically with reference to DNA analysis, can you explain to the jury, first in sort of general terms, how is that analysis performed?
Yes, so for DNA analysis, what we're trying to do is obtain a DNA profile from a piece of evidence and then potentially compare that with a reference sample from a known individual.
Now, is the Bodie Lab accredited?
Yes.
And by whom is it accredited?
Through the National Institute of Standards.
Now, within the Bodie Lab, are there certain steps that are taken to prevent against contamination?
Yes. So at every step of the testing process, we have positive and negative controls. The evidence room is a secure room, so only a handful of people have access to that room. And then everything that we would need to test, we would sign out, and that would be recorded on the chain of custody. The building itself is secure, so you need to swipe your badge to sign in. We wear protective equipment through all parts of the process, so we have gloves, goggles, lab coat, hairnets, masks, and during after we write the reports, all of our results are reviewed prior to being reported.
Now, to that point, sir, is there a review process that your work and any analyst work undergoes at the Bodie Labs?
Yes, so the final step would be a technical and an administrative review.
Now, can you describe that process as far as the technical review and review in general at Bodie?
Yes, so we submit the case file with the report and all of our conclusions, and then another analyst goes through everything and makes sure that they agree with everything that we submitted.
I think you made reference to this a little earlier in your testimony, but as part of the accreditation process, do you undergo proficiency testing?
Yes, twice a year.
And can you explain to the jury that proficiency testing process?
Yes, so twice a year we get what's essentially a mock case submitted from an outside vendor that we treat as if it were an actual case. We go through and do all the testing that we would normally do, and then submit that back to the vendor, and they compare the results to the known results of what they should be.
Now, what areas have you specifically undergone proficiency testing in?
So everything that I am trained and signed off in.
In DNA specifically, is that correct?
Yes.
And have you successfully completed each of those proficiency tests that you've taken?
Yes.
Now, you made reference to this a little earlier, but can you explain to the jury what are positive and negative controls?
Right. So positive controls we use to make sure that the various testing steps that we're performing are working as we expect. So if we have a positive control, we would expect to see the DNA profile that we intend to see in that positive sample. Negative samples we use to make sure that there aren't any sources of contamination along the way. The chemicals that we're using aren't potentially contaminated, or that maybe samples were switched or something along the way.
Now, when you were assigned work within the DNA unit at Bodie Technologies, where do you retrieve that item, or where do you retrieve those items physically from?
Yes, so those would be delivered to our secure evidence room, and then any testing performed, we would need to sign that out, and that would be recorded on the chain of custody.
Now, the secure evidence room, is that temperature controlled at all?
Yes, we have just basic climate control as well as freezers and refrigerators.
And the freezers, refrigerators are commonly referred to as cold storage, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, why is items of evidence stored in cold storage?
Certain items of evidence are stored cold because things like heat, UV light, and moisture can cause microbial activity or degrade the DNA, so we would not get the highest quality results that we would want.
Now, when you retrieve items from the cold storage or from the secured evidence room, how are those items packaged when you receive them for DNA testing?
So they're usually, however they're packed from, like, for example, the police agency that sends it to us, they'll pack them according to their guidelines and standards, and then they're sent to us, and we store them in the freezer. And then when they're signed out on our end, we just have a basic container that we put them in to keep the case together.
Now, sir, what is DNA?
So DNA is basically the manual for a living organism. Most of the DNA is contained within the nucleus of every cell, or pretty much every cell, and it contains all the information that is needed to make an individual.
Now, is DNA the same in every cell of a person's body?
Yes.
And how many steps are included in DNA testing?
So forensic DNA testing, the testing that we did, there are basically 4 steps. So there's DNA extraction, quantification, amplification, and profile detection.
Now, can you describe for the jury what each of those steps are and sort of what they entail?
Yes. So DNA extraction is we are basically trying to separate out the DNA from everything else. So all the other parts of the cell or any other material that might be part of the evidence. So we're left with just the DNA. Next is quantification, and we are trying to figure out how much DNA we have to work with. The steps further down the line are calibrated to a certain amount of DNA input. If we add too much DNA, it can cause problems. So we need to know how much we have to work with. And then the next step is amplification. So this is when we take 20 to 25 different locations within the genome that we're interested in looking at, and we make millions and millions of copies of each of those locations. And in each one of those copies, there's a fluorescent tag that's embedded into each one. So then that leads to the final step of profile detection, where we separate those fragments out by size, and that fluorescent tag allows us to identify those particular locations.
Now, sir, in January of 2024, were you assigned to perform some work on a lab case number, your Bodie lab case number, CCA 2416-0023, pertaining to this defendant, Karen Reed?
Yes.
Now, you received those items for testing from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory, correct?
Correct.
Now, do you also, when you receive items from an outside agency, do you also receive a corresponding submitting agency case number from that agency?
Yes.
And in this case, that was Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory, lab number 22-02184. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, what type of work were you assigned to do in this case?
So in this case, I was assigned to look at an extract that was submitted from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, as well as a hair, and then 2 reference samples that were also submitted.
Now, could you explain to the jury the process that you used to analyze, in general terms, evidence in this case?
Yes, so generally we follow that same process, with the exception of the extract that was submitted. Since the extraction process was already completed, we did not need to do that, and we could move straight to quantification. And then we did the entire process for the hair as well as the reference samples.
Now, you made brief reference to it a moment before, but was there a known standard that was done in this case?
Yes.
And did another analyst test and report the results from the known blood standard of John O'Keefe?
Correct.
And how was that done?
Yes, so the entirety of the testing was performed at the state lab, and they submitted the final profile to us for comparison.
Now, what is a DNA profile?
So a DNA profile is basically just a list of all the variants at those 24 or 25 different locations that we're interested in, and the entirety of those different variations are what makes a DNA profile individual or unique.
Now, as far as when you're looking or analyzing or examining a DNA profile, can you describe for the jury what does it look like? What are you looking at?
So when we're looking at a DNA profile, it's essentially a graph with a series of peaks across the horizontal axis. And those correspond to the length of the DNA fragments that we amplified. And those are assigned a number based on the length of that fragment. And those numbers are what we refer to as the alleles. And those numbers are assembled into essentially a chart, and that's the DNA profile.
Now, could you please describe to the jury the process of comparison between a known standard and an evidence sample?
Yes, so when we have an evidence sample, we need to compare it to a reference sample. And then, so what we do is we take those two tables that I mentioned, one from the evidence sample and one from the reference sample, and we put them next to each other and do a comparison to see if the reference profile is potentially part of the evidence profile. And then if the two are consistent, then we would need to do a statistical calculation to determine the strength of the match. For example, if one in every 3 people would be a potential match, then that's not very strong. So we have to have some sort of mathematical weight to describe the potential match.
Now, if you could again, sir, explain to the jury, what was your role in the testing in this case?
Yes, so my role was to analyze the DNA profiles and then do the comparisons.
Now, what items specifically did you receive for DNA testing in this case?
So yes, like I mentioned, we received the hair, we received the 2 reference samples, we received an extract from a taillight, as well as the negative control that was associated with that. And then we also received a reference profile from the state lab.
Now, starting with what your lab has labeled as EO2, that has a corresponding State Police Crime Lab item number 3-1.1. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what was the description of that item, EO2 3-1.1?
So that was the extract of the sample from the passenger side taillight of a vehicle.
And was there any further description of that vehicle as far as the plate number?
Yes, there was a plate number associated with it.
Okay. And do you recall what the plate number was?
So that would be 3GC684.
And did you receive 2 buckle samples identified as RO3 and RO4?
Yes.
And what was RO3 identified as?
So that was a buccal swab from Yuri Begetic.
And what was RO4 identified as?
So that was a buccal swab from Michael Proctor.
And then that extract portion, that was the part that was labeled as EO2, is that correct?
Correct.
And can you please explain to the jury what an extract is?
So like I mentioned, an extract is essentially, it's a tube with a small amount of liquid in it, and inside that liquid is the DNA that was extracted from the evidence sample.
Now, the known standard of Mr. John O'Keefe, that had an item number as well, is that correct?
Yes.
And what was that item number first from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory?
So that was 8-1.1.1.
And did your lab, Bodie Technologies, have a corresponding item number associated with that known standard?
No, we just used the Massachusetts lab number for that.
And that known standard from John O'Keefe, did that appear to be a standard single source profile?
Yes.
And what is a single source profile?
So a single source profile is essentially a DNA profile from one individual, as opposed to a DNA profile that could be a mixture of multiple individuals.
Now, what does STR stand for?
Stands for short tandem repeat.
And can you please describe that short tandem repeat process for the jury?
Yes, so like I mentioned, what we're doing with STR, short tandem repeat testing, is we're amplifying a number of locations in the genome, and then we're separating them out by size. Now, the reason we do that is because at the DNA level, those regions of the genome have a series of genetic base pairs that repeats over and over again in sequence. So they're short tandem repeated DNA sequences. And the number of times that sequence repeats at that location is what we call the allele. So if the sequence repeated 5 times, we would call that allele 5. And that the summation of all those alleles is what makes the DNA profile.
And what is an SDR mix?
So are you referring to the computer program, StarMix?
Yes, StarMix, excuse me.
Yes, okay. Yes, so when we're dealing with mixture profiles, so that would be DNA, evidence profiles where more than one person's DNA is all mixed together. We need to be able to try to separate that out as best we can. We use a computer program called STRMix or StarMix, and that uses various mathematical calculations that allow us to make the best use of that mixture data that we can. And it allows us to run those statistical calculations to reference profiles as well.
Now, item EO2 from the passenger side taillight of the vehicle. What did you conclude as to that profile?
Yeah, so that was a mixture of 3 individuals, including at least 1 male.
Now, if you could, please sort of walk the jury through that process in making a profile comparison from the profile from the passenger side tail light of the defendant's vehicle and your other submitted samples.
Yes, so when we're using StarMix and we're doing a comparison, we have the StarMix output, and essentially what that's doing is we input, based on the DNA profile that we observe, the number of contributors that we would expect to be there. So in this case, we would say there were 3 individuals. So the StarMix software will break out those 3 different components and give probabilities to each different allele combination. So we would take the reference profile and then compare that to the output from the StarMix program to see if there's a potential inclusion.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about statistical calculations. How are those statistical calculations done?
Yes, so once we determine that there's a potential inclusion in the mixture, we will run what's called a likelihood ratio. So essentially what we're doing there is we're doing a likelihood ratio is we're comparing 2 different explanations for the evidence profile that we obtained. So one of those explanations would be that in this case, the DNA profile is a mixture of one of those reference samples that we're comparing and 2 unknown unrelated individuals. The other explanation would be that it was 3 unknown unrelated individuals. So we compare those 2 and we determine the ratio of which one is more likely.
And where do those statistical numbers or calculations, where do they come from?
So they're all based in the fact that we know how common the different alleles at each location are within the population. So we can do a lot of mathematics and figure out how rare or common different alleles might be.
Now, sir, in your comparison analysis between the taillight sample and the known standard from John O'Keefe, what conclusions did you make from your analysis or comparative analysis between those 2?
Between John O'Keefe and the mixture profile, John O'Keefe could not be excluded as a potential contributor to that mixture profile. And
as far as the statistical analysis, what, if anything, did you find with reference to that?
Yes, so we did, like I mentioned, that likelihood ratio, and in the case of it being a mixture of John O'Keefe and 2 unknown unrelated individuals, it would be 740 nonillion times more likely that it was a mixture of John O'Keefe and 2 unrelated individuals versus 3 unknown unrelated individuals.
Now, that number that you just referenced, as far as 740 nonillion times more likely, how many zeros are in a nonillion?
Nonillion is 30 zeros.
Now, this analysis supported a strong support for inclusion, correct?
Correct.
Now, can you explain to the jury what that means as far as a strong support for inclusion?
Yes, so we have a chart that based on the likelihood ratio, so that 749 million number, based on the different numbers that we might get, we assign a verbal qualifier to that just to make it a little bit more user-friendly. So in this case, it would technically be very strong support for inclusion.
Now, in your comparison analysis between the taillight sample and the known standard from Yuri Buchanan, what conclusions did you make from your analysis of those?
So he could not be visually excluded based on just comparing the profile to the StarMix output. So we do the likelihood ratio to determine that, like I said, that likelihood ratio. So in this case, it was 46 million times more likely that it was 3 unknown unrelated individuals versus Yuri Buchanan and 2 unknown unrelated individuals. So that would be very strong support for exclusion.
And again, sir, if you could just expound a little. When you say very strong support for exclusion, what does that mean?
Again, we're just referring back to the verbal scale that we have as part of our reporting guidelines.
Now, in your comparison analysis between the taillight sample and the known standard from Michael Proctor, what conclusions did you make from your analysis there?
Yes, so he could not be visually excluded, again, based on that initial comparison. So we run the statistic, and it was 76,000 times more likely that it was 3 unknown unrelated individuals versus Michael Proctor and 2 unknown unrelated individuals. And that would be strong support for exclusion.
So with reference to the comparative analysis between Trooper Proctor's DNA sample and the taillight sample, that was a strong support for exclusion, correct?
Correct.
Now, turning your attention to what your lab has labeled as EO1, that has a corresponding Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory item number of 3-6.1. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what was the description that was provided by the external submitting agency as far as that item?
So that was the shaft end of a hair from the exterior passenger side rear panel of that same plate number.
Now, as far as that, and I understand that your lab didn't do it, but you're familiar with the process as far as extracting a DNA profile from a hair, correct?
Yes.
Can you explain that process to the jury?
Yes, so during the extraction process, we dissolve the hair, and then we attempt to do our normal DNA processing.
Now, what is different, if anything, in DNA testing when it comes to hair?
So hair, generally, if it's the hair shaft only, we would not expect to get great STR results. However, it is possible, so we usually attempt that first.
Now, are you familiar with the term follicular tissue?
Yes.
And can you please explain to the jury what that is?
Yes, so that would be the hair follicle, and in the hair follicle, we would expect to find a lot of nuclear DNA. So that would be DNA from the nucleus of cells.
You mentioned any sort of piece of hair, there's a root end and a shaft end, correct?
Correct.
And can you, probably pretty well understood, but could you please explain to the jury the difference between the two?
Yes, so the root end would be the end that we would expect to find the root or the follicle, and then the shaft end would be just the shaft of the hair itself. Now,
what is autosomal DNA testing?
Yes, so autosomal DNA testing. So autosomal DNA is the DNA that from mother and father that's combined in the child. So that would be opposed to DNA that's inherited directly from a single parent. So that would be something like Y chromosome DNA that would be inherited directly from the father. So all the sons of a father would have the same Y profile. Also, there's mitochondrial DNA. So the mitochondria exist outside the nucleus of the cell, and that is inherited directly from the mother. So all of a mother's children would have the same mitochondrial profile.
Now, sir, from your analysis, what were your conclusions for the hair, EO1, in your autosomal or STR testing?
Yes, so we performed the extraction and then the quantification, and the quantification results were below the limit of detection. So we would not expect to get an STR profile from that hair.
And if you could expound just a bit as far as that term below the limit of detection, what exactly does that mean?
Yes, so during the quantification process, our instruments are calibrated as part of our internal validations to detect a certain amount of DNA. And once we get below that amount of DNA, it's determined, we call that undetermined. So that would be below the instrument's limit of detection. And based on those validations, we would not expect to get a profile from that.
And so what happened with the hair extraction sample in your lab at Bodie from there once you had completed the STR testing?
Yes. So like I said, it's not unexpected that the shaft of a hair would not give us STR results. So we often transfer those to the mitochondrial group that does the mitochondrial DNA testing.
And why is that transferred from you to another analyst within the lab?
I'm not personally signed off in mitochondria. We don't do quite enough testing to have everyone signed off in all the different technologies.
Thank you very much, sir. I have no further questions.
All right. Mr. Jackson?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. A couple of quick questions. You mentioned, Mr. Bradford, a quantification related to both Yuri Buchanan and a known sample from former Trooper Michael Proctor. Can we go over? I'm going to ask you about the sample related to Michael Proctor. I think I heard you say 1 in 76,000, correct?
Yes.
Describe that one more time for the jurors. When you quantify that profile as it compares to the population of the Earth, for instance, what does that mean? What's the significance of 1 in 76,000?
Yes. So you need to be very careful when we're talking about statistics, because if we start to introduce different analogies to try to describe them, they start to go off the rails, and we're describing things that are not actually described in the statistic. So it makes a lot of sense to compare that to the population of the Earth, for example. However, what we're talking about here are the relative likelihoods of those two different explanations of the evidence profile. So, like I said, in this case, it's 76,000 times more likely that we would observe that evidence profile if it were 3 unknown, unrelated individuals, as opposed to Michael Proctor and then 2 unknown, unrelated individuals.
And sometimes, Mr. Bradford, we get numbers that are just sort of mind-boggling. Like you said, 30 zeros. What is that number again?
Non-alien.
Non-alien?
Non-alien, yes.
Y'all literally, in your job, like almost have to make up new numbers. Non-alien, none of us have ever heard of that. That's 1 followed by 30 zeros, correct?
Correct.
As opposed to 76,000, which is 76 followed by 3 zeros.
Yes.
Much smaller number by factors of a non-alien, nearly, correct?
Correct.
So when you say that there is strong support for the exclusion of Michael Proctor in that DNA sample, you're not suggesting that he's completely excluded as a potential contributor.
Well, no. What I'm suggesting is what the numbers state, so
Right.
that it's 76,000 times more likely that it were 3 unknown, unrelated individuals versus Michael Proctor and 2 unknown, unrelated individuals.
Understood. So you're not excluding him. You're simply saying statistically there's strong support for exclusion, but he's not excluded as a contributor. Is that right?
I am saying that there is strong support for exclusion, yes.
Understood. With regard to that taillight sample, you were asked to compare known samples to that taillight sample, the known samples being State Trooper Yuri Buchanan and former Trooper Michael Proctor, those 2 known samples, correct?
Correct.
Were you asked to compare a known sample from a person by the name of Brian Higgins?
No.
Were you asked to compare a known sample from a person by the name of Brian Albert?
No.
Were you asked to compare a known sample from a person named Kevin Albert?
No.
Were you asked to compare a known sample from a person by the name of former Chief Kenneth Berkowitz?
No.
Thanks. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. There's Mr. Lally, any follow-up?
No.
All right, you are all set. All set, witness?
May we approach this?
Okay. Please feel Your next witness, please.
Yes, Your Honor. Call Carl Miyasako to the stand.
Okay.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you shall give to the court and the jury in the matter now pending shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Good morning.
Go ahead, Mr. Lally.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling your last name for the court?
Carl Miyasako, Miyasako.
And what do you do for work, sir?
I'm a senior DNA analyst at a forensic laboratory called Bodhi Technology,
And where is Bodhi Technologies located?
Lorton, Virginia.
And where did you go to school?
Virginia Commonwealth University.
And what degrees did you receive there?
I have a bachelor's of science in forensic science.
Now, following your education, where did you go to work?
Bodhi Technology.
And how long have you worked there?
I've been employed at that laboratory for over 11 years.
And when you joined Bodhi Technologies, what was your position and title that you were initially hired for?
Initially, I started off as a DNA technician.
And when did you become an analyst?
After a few years at the laboratory, I became a DNA analyst.
What is the difference at Bodhi Lab between a technician and an analyst?
Technician mainly does laboratory work, and an analyst is allowed to analyze data and write reports.
Now, could you please describe for the jury the training that you underwent initially as a technician?
So I observed people perform all the tasks that I was training in, and then I'm supervised performing tasks by a qualified individual, and then I do competency tests where I'm performing things independently.
Now, is there a continuing educational component of Bodhi?
Yes.
And could you please describe for the jury what that entails?
So continuing education just allows analysts or technicians to keep up to date with current topics within the community and future advancements in technologies.
Now, could you please describe for the jury what type of lab Bodhi is?
Bodhi is a private accredited forensic laboratory.
And where do your cases come from?
Our cases come from different agencies throughout the country, so law enforcement agencies, medical examiners, other laboratories as well.
And is that purely on a statewide basis, national basis, or something else?
National basis.
And what is the difference at Bodhi Lab or Bodhi Technologies between a DNA Analyst 1 and a DNA Analyst 2?
The type of caseload and different cases being assigned to these individuals.
Now, what is your current role at Bodhi Labs?
My current role is a senior DNA analyst.
And what is a senior DNA analyst, and what do you do in that role?
So senior analyst provides expertise or leadership in at least one discipline within the company. Senior analysts report challenging cases, are independent of other analysts, and also train other analysts as well.
So I'm going to ask you to keep your voice up, please.
And sir, that microphone in front of you is adjustable. You can put it as close to yourself as you feel comfortable with. Thank you, Your Honor. Now, specifically with reference to DNA analysis, can you explain to the jury first in general terms how that analysis is performed at your lab?
Yeah, so it starts with receipt of evidence, and then it goes through the laboratory through different procedures up until we develop that DNA profile and it gets interpreted and analyzed.
Now, is the Bodhi Lab accredited?
Yes.
And by whom is it accredited?
We are accredited by ANSI National Accreditation Board.
Now, are there steps taken within your lab at Bodhi to prevent against contamination?
Yeah, we have protocols to monitor contamination and to also prevent contamination.
Now, also at the lab, is there a review process, and can you sort of describe your role as it applies as a senior DNA analyst to that review process?
Yeah, so all cases go through a review process. So after, let's say, the reporting analyst completes a case, it goes into submission for a technical review. During that review process, the entire case file is looked over. So it's looked over to see if everything was done per protocol, if it's something that I or anyone else in the lab would have done, if any necessary processing steps were taken. Data is reviewed. If there was comparisons, that's something that a reviewing analyst would also do and see if they come to the same conclusions as the other analysts.
Now, just again, in general terms, can you explain to the jury just a little bit more in detail as far as the protocols that a technical review is concerned with, and sort of how a technical review is able to establish that the testing was done in comportment with that?
Yeah, so as me, if I were doing a technical review or look over the entire case file, did what the processing steps happen were they per protocol? Is it also something that I would have done in this case? If data is ultimately generated, I also do that comparison. Based on that comparison, what did I come to the conclusion to? Was that the same as the other analysts? Did we agree? Were stats done? Were they done the same way I would have done it? Essentially, all conclusions would have to be in alignment between both analysts.
And so when you're doing a technical review, you're looking at or doing your own sort of comparisons, coming to your own conclusions, and running your own statistics. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm doing the comparisons myself and seeing if I also agree and come to the same conclusions.
Now, as part of the accreditation process, do you undergo any sort of proficiency testing?
We do.
And can you explain to the jury that proficiency testing process at Bodhi Technologies?
So an outside organization sends tests to our laboratory. Everyone participating in these proficiency testing completes their assignment. It gets submitted back to the organization, and they review the results to see if it matches up with the expected results on their end.
And how often do analysts at your lab undergo proficiency testing?
Twice a year.
Now, turning to you specifically, what areas do you specifically undergo proficiency testing in?
I do testing within short tandem repeats, STRs, YSTRs, mitochondrial DNA analysis.
And have you successfully completed each of those proficiency tests that you've taken?
I have.
Now, could you explain to the jury what are positive and negative controls, and sort of what is the difference between the two of those?
So throughout processing, we introduce controls such as a positive and negative control. Positive control is just a known template that we introduce during processing. It measures the efficacy of the testing and to see if we develop the known profile that we are expecting, just to make sure that testing went as it should have. Negative control, on the other hand, monitors for any type of contamination and cleanliness of reagents. And there's no DNA template introduced in this, so we don't expect data. So once that aligns with it, then we know that reagents used were good.
Now, sir, are you familiar with some mitochondrial DNA testing that was performed at Bodhi on lab case number CCA 2416-0023 pertaining to this defendant, Karen Reed?
Yes.
And the lab received those items for testing from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory, correct?
Correct.
And did you also, or do you also receive a corresponding agency case number from that or any submitting agency?
Yes.
And in this case was the Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory, lab number 22-02184.
Yes.
And what type of work did Bodhi Labs do on CCA 2416-0023 with respect to mitochondrial DNA testing?
So we received 2 evidence items, a hair sample and a reference sample, and we were asked to type these for mitochondrial DNA.
Now, could you explain to the jury the process in general terms used to analyze that type of evidence?
So it's a similar process that you may have heard already for nuclear DNA or STRs. After DNA extraction, that's where we isolate and release DNA from the sample. It goes through amplification processing. This is where we employ the polymerase chain reaction or PCR technique. So we create numerous copies of targeted section within the DNA. This is just so we have enough DNA to generate a DNA profile. Following that, we do what's called quantification. So we determine a generated estimate of how much DNA is present within the sample. Following that, we do what's called sequencing. So we used a technique called Sanger sequencing. So bases within the sample, the order bases are determined, and bases are essentially building blocks of the DNA. So everyone has 4 bases in their DNA, and we refer to these bases to the letters A, G, T, and C. After sequencing, we go through what's called capillary electrophoresis, and so these bases are sequenced individually, and the data is interpreted.
Now, was there a known standard done in this case?
Yes.
And did another analyst test and report the results from the known blood standard from Mr. John O'Keefe?
What was that? Sorry.
Sure. Did another analyst test and report the results from the known blood standard from a Mr. John O'Keefe?
Yes.
And again, with reference to mitochondrial DNA testing, what items did the Bodie lab test for?
A hair shaft sample and the known DNA standard.
Now, can you please describe to the jury, again in general terms, the process of comparison between a known standard and an evidence sample?
So we generate data from typically the evidence sample first, and then just to see that we get comparable data, and then we process the known reference standard. Then we look at the 2 DNA profiles of these different samples, and we compare them. Based on the data, are we seeing that we can or cannot exclude the reference donor as being a source of the evidence sample?
What is autosomal DNA?
Autosomal DNA is like nuclear DNA. It's something that you maybe more, when thought of forensics, traditional STR shorthanded repeats. And
what is mitochondrial DNA?
Mitochondrial DNA is a different type of DNA from nuclear DNA. Nuclear DNA, you get half of your DNA from your parents, so mom and dad, whereas mitochondrial DNA, it gets entirely inherited from mother to child.
What is the difference between the 2 as far as where it's located in reference to the nucleus of the cell?
So with STRs, there's basically 2 copies per cell, whereas with mitochondrial DNA, there's several copies per cell. So there's more abundance in mitochondrial DNA.
Now, how does that apply to an extract from a hair sample?
So for hair samples, we typically categorize these with like hairs with roots and rootless hair samples. So with hair samples, typically in the shaft end, there's more abundance of the mitochondrial DNA versus nuclear DNA, where nuclear DNA tends to be degraded or not present in high enough amounts.
What does PCR stand for?
PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction.
And can you please describe the PCR method to the jury?
Yes, so that's the process where we create specific targeted sections of the DNA over and over. So we're replicating DNA using the source material as a template. This is because we want enough copies of that DNA to generate the end result of a DNA profile. So it would be similar to, say, like a copy machine. You start with a single piece of paper, and you make many, many copies from that piece of paper.
Now, sir, you alluded to it, I believe, earlier in your testimony, but just specifically as to this topic, what is DNA sequencing?
DNA sequencing is where we determine the order of bases within that sample.
And how is DNA sequencing used specifically in mitochondrial DNA testing?
So we use that to generate the sequence specific to that sample so that when we get the end result data, we compare it to a known standard or a common reference standard, and any differences from that common standard gets reported as that individual's mitochondrial profile.
Now, how is the testing different between autosomal versus mitochondrial DNA testing?
A lot of it does have some similarities, but the difference comes with STRs being more of a length fragment testing, and mitochondrial DNA is more of a base nucleotide DNA testing.
Now, as far as the running of the DNA, how is that sort of physically done, or what kind of tools are you using specific to mitochondrial DNA testing?
Yeah, so we use different instrumentation, such as like a thermocycler to do the PCR step. And then we also use what's called like a genetic analyzer at the end step of capillary electrophoresis.
Is there a certain type of gel that's used as far as visualization of that profile?
Yeah, so during the quantification step, we use what's called a yield gel, and we get a visual presentation of how much DNA is present within that sample.
When you say a visual presentation, visual, like what type of instruments are you using to get that visualization?
So we use a gel and a UV light and a camera to capture essentially what we refer to as a band.
And what does that band look like?
It's generally if there is presence of mitochondrial DNA within that sample, it emits a bright band on this gel. If there isn't anything, then we don't observe that band.
And what kind of instrumentation does your lab utilize in mitochondrial DNA testing?
We use a thermocycler or 3130 genetic analyzer as well.
Could you spell that, please?
The thermocycler, or THERMALCYCLER.
And then what were the digits after it?
And then the genetic analyzer is a 3130 3130.
And if you could you please describe what those instruments do or what they're used for specifically within the process of the mitochondrial DNA testing?
Yeah, so instruments is common within laboratories for automation purposes, so that thermocycler helps with the PCR stages, and then the genetic analyzer helps with the separation of the individual bases and then generating that end result data where the analyst will interpret the data.
Now, what is a D-loop?
The D-loop is the control region.
And how does that D-loop factor into this type of analysis?
So with mitochondrial DNA analysis, we analyze certain regions within the D-loop or the control region, and we refer to these as hypervariable regions, so HV1 and HV2.
And what does the D-loop have to do with certain variabilities within the human population?
So this region is a non-coding region within the mitochondria, so it can allow for mutations because it wouldn't affect the mitochondria functions. Because of this highly variable difference within this region, it's useful for determining different maternal populations.
Now, did the Bodie lab also perform mitochondrial DNA testing on the known standard from John O'Keefe?
Yes.
And is that mitochondrial DNA testing the same for the known standard of John O'Keefe as it is, as you've been describing, with reference to the evidence sample?
Yes.
And what is then done generally in the comparison of those two profiles?
So once we develop the profiles from these two separate sources, a comparison is done to each other, and we look at it to see if the profiles consistent, essentially matching with each other, and seeing if an exclusion or inclusion can be made.
And did you then perform your own comparative analysis of those two mitochondrial DNA profiles from the hair extracts from the rear panel of the defendant's vehicle and that of the known standard of Mr. O'Keefe?
I did.
And what is your opinion or conclusions that you arrived at from that comparative analysis?
Sustained.
Hold
Hold on. Ask it differently, Mr. Nolan.
What conclusions did you come to from that comparative analysis between those two standards?
That John O'Keefe could not be excluded as being a source of the hair sample.
Now, can you expound a little as far as your conclusion is concerned? What does that mean?
Yeah, if I may refer to my report.
Yes.
So whenever we have a conclusion of a probable inclusion, like in this case where I could not exclude John O'Keefe as being a source of the hair sample, we do a statistical analysis to give weight to that probable inclusion. So in this case, using a database and with 95% confidence, at least 90% can be excluded as being a source of that hair sample.
And let me ask you just in general terms, that database used is referred to as MPOP, EMPOP, is that correct?
Correct.
And what's an MPOP?
So it's a searchable database where we search microfiles in the database and to see how common rare in the population. Up in our laboratory, we searched 3 main population groups within the United States: African American, Caucasian, Hispanic. And so the general goal is just to see how rare would that profile be within these populations.
And so what conclusions did you come to with reference to the consistency of sample versus Mr. O'Keefe's sample in the MPOP database?
95% confidence that 95% of the population can be excluded as being a source of the hair sample.
Now, you made reference in your testimony a moment before about a confidence interval. What is that?
Yeah, so whenever we obtain statistical data, we use a confidence interval or upper limit frequency. This is just like a range where the true value of said profile is, but we generally want to report like a conservative end to avoid any false inclusions. So it's at least 99.895% that the majority of the population can be excluded, but it could be higher, but at the lower end, it would be at least 99.895%.
And what confidence interval in your conclusion does this consistency between the hair sample profile from the rear quarter panel of the defendant's vehicle have to Mr. O'Keefe's mitochondrial DNA profile?
So it's the 95% confidence, 99.985% of the population. So the majority of the population could be excluded. However, with John O'Keefe and his maternal relatives, they could not.
Thank you, sir. I have nothing further on.
Okay. Mr. Jackson?
Yeah, Your Honor.
Good morning, Mr. Miyasaka.
Good morning.
Couple of quick questions. Mitochondrial DNA, as you've explained, is different than autosomal DNA in pretty significant ways, correct?
Correct.
What we think of as traditional nuclear DNA, that's autosomal DNA. That's the DNA that we derive from mom and dad, comes down to the child, correct?
Correct.
Mitochondrial DNA, by contrast, is simply the maternal line, excluding the dads, correct?
Correct.
So my mitochondrial DNA has nothing to do with my father, everything to do with my mother. Is that right?
Yeah, mitochondrial DNA gets inherited from the mom to child.
Okay, so a male like John O'Keefe, for instance, the known sample that you were working with, shares the exact same mitochondrial DNA as, for instance, his mother, correct?
Correct. His mom and any other maternally related individuals.
You just took the words right out of my mouth, and that's my next question. Stop being smarter than me. It's going to be a tough task. It's also the exact same mitochondrial DNA for his grandmother, right?
Correct.
And let's move the lineage off the tree trunk and move it onto branches. For instance, if his mother had 2 children, John and a sister, his sister would also have the exact same mitochondrial DNA, correct?
Correct.
And now, staying on that branch of the tree, going out to a leaf, if his sister had children, those children would have the exact same mitochondrial DNA.
Correct.
So another way of saying that, his maternal niece, his maternal nephew, would have the identical mitochondrial DNA as John O'Keefe, correct?
Correct.
Okay. When you indicated that John O'Keefe is included in the population of those who match that profile, that does not mean that you're determining that the hair that you analyzed came from John O'Keefe, does it?
No, with mitochondrial DNA analysis, it's not unique to individual. Compared to traditional STRs or short chain repeat, that could be unique to individual. But with mitochondrial DNA, it's not unique to individual, but more so a maternal lineage.
All right. So, Mr. Miyasako, very importantly, you're not sitting here saying that that hair belonged to John O'Keefe.
I'm saying that the hair sample on John O'Keefe cannot be excluded, as well as his maternal relatives.
So we're speaking in negatives. I want to speak in a positive. You are not saying that John O'Keefe, that hair belonged to John O'Keefe, are you? Yes or no?
Sustained.
Are you suggesting to these jurors that the hair that you analyzed belonged to John O'Keefe?
Sustained.
Are you telling the jurors, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that the hair that you analyzed belonged to John O'Keefe?
I'll see you at time.
Sure. May I inquire?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Miyasako, going back to my question, you're not saying that the hair belonged to John O'Keefe, correct? That's not what you're saying.
What I'm saying is, based on the genetic data obtained from the hair sample and the genetic data obtained from the known reference sample of John O'Keefe, I could not exclude John O'Keefe as being a possible source of the hair sample. In addition, all maternally related individuals could not be excluded as being a source of the hair sample.
Another way of saying that, Mr. Miyasako, is to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, you cannot say that hair belonged to John O'Keefe specifically, can you? Yes or no?
No, with mitochondrial DNA, you can't
Okay.
say that it is per se an individual person, so it's more so the maternal line.
Because the hair could have come from his mom, it could have come from his maternal nephew, or anybody in his maternal line, correct?
Correct. If
Okay.
they also had access to that stuff, then yeah.
For instance, access to that stuff, meaning if his maternal nephew lived in the home with him, where the SUV was stored, it's just as reasonable if the hair came from him, correct?
Sustained.
Your analysis does not tell us when the hair got to where it was found, correct?
Correct.
Your analysis does not tell us how the hair got to where it was found, correct?
Correct.
And mitochondrial DNA does not reveal anything about the hair's color or age or texture, nothing like that.
Not on the analysis that we performed.
Okay. So for all you know, that hair could have been placed where it was found by somebody else.
Sustained.
You're not telling this jury how the hair got where it was ultimately found and recovered, correct?
Correct. Our testing is just based on the evidence provided to us and the comparisons done between the two different evidence.
And in short, you can't say that the hair specifically came from John O'Keefe either, can you?
With mitochondrial DNA, I can't say that it is specific to an individual.
Okay. Including John O'Keefe.
In this instance, John O'Keefe's profile was consistent with the hair sample.
That's not what my question was, Mr. Miyasako. We can go round and round. I realize that you're saying it's consistent, but it's also consistent with his nephew, right?
Correct. I can't exclude maternal relatives because mitochondrial DNA is not specific to individual, but just the maternal line.
Right. So you're not saying it was John O'Keefe's hair?
I can't say whether it is, but the profile obtained from John O'Keefe is consistent with that hair sample.
You're not
But
saying it's John O'Keefe.
Mr. Jackson, Mr. Jackson, let's move on.
The reason you can't say that it's John O'Keefe's hair is because it also matches everybody in his maternal line. That's what we're getting down to, correct?
yeah, with mitochondrial DNA, again, it's not unique to an individual, but their maternal lineage.
And if his maternal nephew lived in the same residence and had access to the same SUV, couldn't exclude him either, right?
Sustained.
So in sum, in short, Mr. Miyasako, you cannot tell this jury when the hair got to where it was, correct?
Sustained.
You can't tell this jury how the hair got to where it was found, correct?
Sustained.
And you certainly cannot tell the jury that the hair belonged to John, right?
Sustained.
I think we've got it. Thanks, Your Honor.
Mr. Lally, anything?
So, Mr. Miyasako, including the MPOP, the statistics, and the confidence interval, what is your conclusion in reference to the comparative analysis from mitochondrial profiles from the hair sample from the rear quarter panel of the defendant's vehicle and the known standard of John O'Keefe?
Based on the genetic data obtained for the two different samples, I could not exclude John O'Keefe's known standards profile being consistent with the hair samples profile, and with 95% confidence, at least 99.895% of the population can be excluded as a source of the evidence.
Thank you, sir. Nothing further.
One final question, Your Honor. Do you also maintain that 95% confidence that it was nephew?
Yeah, so again, with maternal
You can
populations.
finish your answer. Go.
With maternal populations, I can't exclude anybody maternally related to John O'Keefe as well.
Thank you very much, sir. You are all set. is the Commonwealth's next witness?
Commonwealth's next witness is Shannon Burgess.
Okay.
So you're gonna step up, please, the clerk, raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you shall give to the court and the jury in the matter now pending shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, I do. Thank you. You have a seat.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, Mr. Brennan, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please introduce yourself to the jurors, spell your last name for the court reporter?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Shannon Burgess, last name Burgess.
Mr. Burgess, what do you do for a profession?
Sure. So I'm a digital forensics examiner. So I investigate digital devices to see what evidence they may record or hold.
Do you specialize in any type of forensic analysis?
Sure. So digital forensics is kind of a broad field, but I do specialize in vehicle forensics and cell phone forensics.
How long have you been a digital forensic analyst for?
Sure. So I've been a digital forensic analyst for approximately 10 years.
Before you were a digital forensic analyst, what type of work did you do?
Sure. So before I was a digital forensics analyst, I was working in the automotive manufacturing field, specifically related to automotive presses and industrial robotics.
I want to talk to you about some of your experience in digital forensic. Did you receive any certifications in digital forensics?
I did. I've received several certifications, one being what's called GIAC, Advanced Smartphone Forensics, another from Celebrite, a company named Celebrite, in Certified Mobile Examiner, and then certifications from Magnet Forensics as well.
Is Magnet a company that also includes Axiom?
Yes, Magnet is a company that produces the software known as Axiom.
In addition to your certifications, how many hours of specialized training approximately have you had in digital forensics?
Sure. So approximately, over the last 10 years, I've had around 700 hours of training, including courses and conference attendance in digital forensics.
In addition to your training and your study, do you have experience over the 10 years? Have you involved yourself in many cases regarding forensics found from a motor vehicle?
Yes, I have.
Can you give a general estimate of how many cases you've worked on?
Not off the top of my head, I couldn't, but it's been numerous.
You said that you specialize in mobile phones and digital forensics in motor vehicles.
That is correct.
Do you teach seminars on those issues?
I do. I teach seminars and presentations specifically in those disciplines.
Who are some of the audiences that you teach to?
Sure. So it ranges from attorneys to engineers that specialize in accident reconstruction to police agencies such as Interpol, which is a global police organization.
Have you testified as an expert in digital forensics in court before?
Yes, I have.
Have you ever testified as an expert regarding digital forensics in state courts?
Yes, I have.
And could you share with us those state courts?
Sure. So those state courts would be Oregon, Texas, Arkansas, New Mexico, and those would be the ones in the last 4 years that I can recall off the top of my head.
Have you testified as an expert in digital forensics in federal courts before?
No, just in state courts.
Have you testified in state courts in civil cases?
Yes, I have.
Have you testified for plaintiffs in civil cases?
I have testified for plaintiffs and defense in civil cases.
And have you testified in criminal cases before?
I have testified in criminal cases as well.
Have you testified for the prosecution before?
I have testified for the prosecution as well as the defense.
Does the data change regardless of who you testify for?
No, it does not.
Where are you presently employed, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So I'm presently employed with a company known as Aperture, and I'm located in their Dallas office.
Is Aperture a company that has offices outside of Texas?
Sure. So Aperture is a company across the country. So they've got a number of locations and offices, and they offer a number of service lines specifically related to forensics.
Do you ever work on different cases or scenarios with people in the Texas office?
Yes, I do. Sure. Go ahead.
Do you ever work with other employees of Aperture outside of the Texas office?
Yes. So I do occasionally corroborate with other experts in the Texas offices as well as the other offices across the country.
In this case, was there another professional who worked with Aperture that was related to this case that you talked to?
There was.
And who was that?
That would be Dr. Judson Welcher.
Is Dr. Welcher's profession and job the same as yours?
No, it is not.
What's the difference between what you do and what Dr. Judd Welcher does?
Sure. So what I do is investigate digital devices that can range from cell phones to vehicle modules to computer systems. What Dr. Welcher does is specifically related to accident reconstruction and biomechanics.
So you are not an accident reconstruction engineer?
I am not.
You are focused on the data?
I am focused on the data.
Did you ever publish any writings or papers regarding the area of your expertise?
Sure. So I have published 2 papers, specifically one related to damaged devices, and that is referencing event data recorders, which is your black box or your airbag control module, and specifically related to developing proof of concepts, because a lot of times these modules will store data in different places on the module. Proof of concepts are ways to verify and validate where that data is stored, so you're not missing data.
So the first article that you wrote about damaged modules, was that peer reviewed?
It was.
And was it accepted?
It was accepted.
Could you tell us briefly what peer reviewed means?
Sure. So peer review is a process of your peers or colleagues reviewing your work and determining that it's valid.
Is peer reviewed articles often relied upon by other experts in the field?
Yes, they are.
You said that the first article you mentioned had to do with damaged modules. Is that one of the areas specifically that you're going to talk to us about in this case?
Sure. So it is specifically one of the areas I'm going to talk about in this case. And to kind of go back a little bit, the idea of proof of concept applies not only to damaged modules, but also other vehicle modules such as infotainment and telematics modules.
I don't think we're at infotainment and telematics yet, so if we can just understand a little better, very basically, what is proof of concept in action? What does that mean?
Sure. So proof of concept is taking a vehicle module, for example. This is typically an unidentified vehicle module that other individuals have not looked at or verified what is recorded and where it is stored. So a proof of concept is taking exemplar modules and doing tests on those modules. So creating events that are recorded within the modules. A lot of times when those modules are damaged in vehicle crashes or if they're just unsupported by your forensic tools, you will have to go to what's called chip off or chip swap forensics. That is specifically taking the chips off of the circuit board. So think of the hard drives from your computer, moving those hard drives to another module, a working module, to recover the data and validating that you've recovered all the data that you would expect to see.
Are there times in cases or studies where you need to recover data because it's not available to you through the traditional methods?
Yes, many times.
Let me ask you, you said there was a second article. What was that second peer review article about?
Sure. So that second peer-reviewed article was specifically related to mobile forensics, specifically iPhones, and how they track your device interactions as well as speed and location data and validating how accurate that data was.
In addition to talking to us about damaged modules, as you're going to do in this case, are you also going to talk to us about the timing information from mobile phones?
Yes, I am.
When did you first become involved in the study of this case?
So I first became involved in this case around October of 2024.
When you became involved in October of 2024, were you in receipt of any information or reports or documents to look at?
Yes, so I did receive some raw data as well as some photographs from the vehicle in this case.
When you say raw data from the vehicle, what does that mean specifically?
Sure. So again, when you take these chips or hard drives off of these modules, you can read those chips individually and recover any type of data that is recorded on those chips. So when I reference raw data, that is looking at that data in hexadecimal format, which is as close to binary data, which is what computers use to store data in, as you would want to get when reviewing this type of data.
When you receive data, does that presume it's already been downloaded by somebody?
Yes, that is correct.
In addition to looking at the data, you receive photographs. Do you know where those photographs came from?
I do not know specifically who those photographs came from, but I do know those photographs came from an initial download attempt on those modules.
You said there was an initial download attempt. When you looked at the information you received, did you learn whether or not there was an attempt prior to your involvement in October 2024 to obtain data from the modules or the so-called black box in the Lexus vehicle?
Yes, so there was an attempt to download data from the modules in the vehicle.
Did you understand whether or not there was a chip-off process, whether anybody attempted to take the computer chips off the computer boards and learn or download the data?
Yes, there was an attempt to remove various chips off of the boards and read those chips individually.
Did you have an opportunity to read any reports submitted regarding that earlier process that occurred before you even got involved?
Not before I got involved. Well, sorry. Yes, I was able to read a report from a individual known as AG Speak about that process, that initial process.
Did you learn who conducted, the name of the person that actually conducted the original process before you were involved in this case?
Yes, I understand that person to be Miss Maggie Gaffney.
Do you know generally when Miss Gaffney engaged in trying to download information from the computer boards of the defendant's car?
Yeah, if I can recall correctly, that was around December of 2023.
And in your review of materials and study of materials, did you receive additional materials?
Yes, I did receive additional crash reports, just detailing the events of the night.
When you say crash reports, what does that mean?
So that's going to be crash reports from the Massachusetts State Police.
Is a crash report just a written report, or is it data?
No, it's just a report, no data.
Did you receive any other reports from any other individuals or experts?
No, not at that time.
Did you later, over time, receive any more additional information during your studies?
Yes, I believe so. And let me reference my report just so I don't misspeak.
Let me ask for the court's permission before you do that.
Sure, sorry.
Yes.
So I did, again, I reviewed a vehicle forensics report by AG Speak. I reviewed documentation that was identified to me as evidence review, a prior testimony of Trooper Garino, and I reviewed some surveillance videos as well as a report by Mr. Whiffen.
When did you receive any study or reports from Mr. Garino? Do you remember?
I do not remember exactly.
Okay. Was it recently, some time ago?
It would have been some time ago, probably late 2024 after we got involved.
Last year?
Yes.
And how about Mr. Whiffen's reports?
Mr. Whiffen's report, I believe I received in January of this year.
In the video, do you know when you received any video?
It would have been this year. I don't remember the exact dates.
Was it last month, months ago?
No, probably around January or February as well. Well, I take that back. It would have been early January, maybe late December.
I want to ask you just generally so we have a general perspective on this. When you began your study, was there something specifically that you were looking for?
There was. So specifically what we're looking for when we do a chip off on these vehicle modules, we're expecting to see one of two things: user data in a raw hexadecimal format, or a file system where user data is stored.
Were there certain events that you were focused on relative to the data in the defendant's Lexus?
Sure. So there were specific events that we were looking for specifically. That would be including time-stamped ignition-on events or power-on events, as well as other data.
Did you have any information or understanding that there were text stream events that you were to focus on?
Yes, I did have an understanding that there were text stream events located in a airbag control module.
How many text stream events were you focused on?
2 text stream events.
Could you just generally characterize those 2 events?
Sure. So one event has been identified as a 3-point turn maneuver, and the other has been identified as a backing maneuver.
Now, the studies of those events, is that the role of the accident reconstructionist?
Yes, it is.
So then what was your role related to, your specific role related to those 2 characterized events, the 3-point turn event and the backing maneuver event?
Sure. So within that text stream data, those events are documented with what's called a time count. So that's going to be a running timer from the time the vehicle powers on or the ignition comes on. So that counter will count seconds incrementally. And specifically, the focus was looking for any time-stamped data that would offer when that power-on event occurred.
Did you put together a PowerPoint presentation regarding your assessment of some of this case?
Yes, I did.
May I approach?
Yes.
Handing you a package, do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
That is my PowerPoint presentation that I prepared.
Can you just turn a few pages so
Sure.
you can look and see if that accurately reflects the presentation you put together?
Yes, it appears so.
And does this reflect some of your study of this case?
It does reflect some of the study in this case.
Is it an entire comprehensive study of everything that you learned, or is it an overview?
No, it is an overview.
For the course permission, I would mark this for identification. I intend to use this with the course permission as a chalk.
Okay, so we'll mark it for identification.
Exhibit SS for identification.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes.
Sir, I want you to teach us a little bit about the computers in a motor vehicle. Is there one computer, like a black box in an airplane?
No, so there's actually many. Depending on the vehicle, there could be hundreds with very specific functions to what they're what they're meant to do.
Tell us a little bit about why there's a need, or why many computers are used in a single vehicle.
Sure. So there's so many functions within your modern vehicle nowadays. So for instance, your infotainment module, that is a computer that operates your radio, your head unit. So that's going to be your obviously your radio, any type of built-in navigations, Android Auto, Apple CarPlay. There's what's called a telematics module. That's going to be what actually allows the vehicle to communicate with the internet services. So when you look at, if you've got an app that can track your vehicle or unlock your doors, that's being allowed through that telematics module.
With the court's permission, I'd like to have Ms. Gilman show page 3 of the PowerPoint.
Okay. Any objection, Mr. Lassie?
No objection, Your Honor. Thank you.
Sir, on your PowerPoint page 3, you have a chalk or diagram of a car. You may have a pointer in front of you if it helps.
Sure.
You could direct your attention to the TV to your right. Could you explain to us what this diagram shows us?
Sure. So this is a diagram that just shows, a small number of modules that you can find in specifically the Lexus in this case. Again, what we're focused on and looking at is the infotainment module and the telematics module in orange. For example, there are other modules known as the body control module and the airbag control module, the engine control module, which runs your vehicle. In addition to that, there are other modules that operate your door locks and unlocks, your windows, and various other functions.
When you use the word module, is that the same thing as a separate computer, or is it different somehow?
Yeah, so that using parlance, module would be referring to a separate computer within the vehicle.
Do all of these separate computers in the vehicle connect with each other?
They do. So all of these modules are connected to one another, and they do communicate with each other.
The information that would be commonly referred to as black box, or information that captures some of an event, where would that be in this diagram?
Sure. So the black box would be in the airbag control module.
And then as far as the radio system, you shared with us that's the infotainment module?
Yes. So the radio system is going to be, that data is going to be stored within the infotainment module.
In the telematics module, specifically, what are we looking for there?
Sure. So the telematics module, again, is a module that allows communication with internet services. So if you've got an app on your phone that you can unlock or lock your doors, that's the telematics module is allowing that function to occur.
Do all make and model cars have the same setup as this diagram?
No, they do not. It will vary.
Does it vary from car maker to car maker?
It does. It varies from car maker to car maker. It varies from trim level as well.
Could two different cars from the same manufacturer, same style, could they have different components in those cars?
They could, yes.
Why is that?
Sure. So during the manufacturing phase, depending on cost and other things, manufacturers will source these modules from different third-party manufacturers. So one vehicle may have a module from, for instance, LG Electronics. One may have a module from Denso. And depending on how those individual manufacturers implement that software and hardware, they may record and store different types of data.
So from your experience, you've reviewed or you studied a 2022 Lexus, and then you see another Lexus, whether it's 2022, 2023. Would you be able to say you've seen it, you've already done it, or do you have to individually look at each car?
Sure. So you would typically look at, and to correct, it's a 2021 Lexus. But if you want to understand what may be stored in a subject module, you would look at, take an exemplar vehicle and conduct some testing to determine what is being recorded and how that data is being recorded.
You mentioned that you were looking for time information or power on information regarding two events.
Correct.
Can we characterize those events as text stream events?
Yes, we can.
Do people sometimes refer to them as triggering events?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Are they often or sometimes referred to as something else other than a text stream event?
They can be referred to as other things besides text stream events.
Can you give us an example of what else they may be referred to as?
Sure. So that would be triggering events.
Why is it called a triggering event?
Sure. So the event is actually created when there's a trigger, and those trigger thresholds will vary and could be for a number of different reasons.
When a text stream event happens, or a so-called triggering event, what happens in the data?
Sure. So when a text stream event happens, there is when that trigger is met, there is certain data parameters or data types that are recorded for a specific time frame.
In this case, how many of those events were you looking at?
Just one.
When you mentioned time, I want to have you explain to us a little bit about time. You said there's a running clock. Can you explain that in a little more detail and simply what that means?
Sure. So in what's recorded within the text stream events, I'll refer to as a running clock. Essentially what it is when the vehicle is powered on, this clock starts to run and it counts seconds from power on. So when you press the ignition on, this clock starts, and when there is a text stream event that occurs within that cycle or within that ignition on, that is recorded as the time that trigger occurred.
Does that give an actual time, like when you look at your watch or you look at your cell phone?
It does not give an actual time, yeah.
Your Honor, pardon the interruption. The chalk remains on the screen.
Okay, are you still reviewing the chalk?
We can take it down if it pleases Attorney Alisi.
Thank you.
So you were getting back to the clock. You said it's like a running clock. Is that like a stopwatch?
Yeah, that could be referred to as a stopwatch.
Where is that running clock kept in the data?
Sure. So that running clock is kept within the airbag control module.
Is that the so-called black box part of the data?
That is correct.
With the running clock, how do you determine the actual time as it relates to, say, for example, your digital watch or your iPhone or another clock?
Sure. So in that instance, you would need to have an event that occurs, such as a power on event, with a timestamp to reference back that running clock.
When you got involved in this case and you looked at the information that was previously downloaded by Ms. Gaffney, was there any data regarding power on, power off to mark that time?
From the initial download, there was not.
When you involved yourself in your study, what was your primary focus as far as information you wanted to get and why?
Sure. So primary focus when I initially got brought on was to look at the modules and see if there's any data that was not recovered. And then specifically, again, looking at any time-stamped data that may have been recorded within the modules.
You talked about the differences in modules. In your PowerPoint, did you provide a couple of photographs of the modules so we can see what you're talking about?
Yes, I did.
With the court's permission, I'd like to put on page 4 of the PowerPoint.
Okay.
No objection, Your Honor.
Yep.
Could you explain to us the photograph on the left and then the photograph on the right?
Sure. So the photograph on the left is kind of a top-down view of the infotainment module from the Lexus. Photograph on the right is a top-down view of the telematics module from the Lexus.
Are these modules from this specific car, or is this a general photograph of a car and how it works?
These modules are from this specific vehicle.
From the car you studied?
Correct.
On the left infotainment module, you have different manufacturers. Why is that?
Sure. So again, these modules are not manufactured by Lexus or Toyota themselves. They are manufactured by third parties that are providing these modules to the car manufacturer. And these are just some examples of what we have seen within these specific vehicles and what type of manufacturers provide modules for these vehicles.
If we could turn to page 5, please. When you looked at the data that was provided in this case, did you draft a report?
Yes, I did.
Your initial impressions, can you share with us what your initial impressions were?
Sure. So initial impressions were that data was missed from the initial download.
What type of data do you think was missed, or did you conclude was missed from the initial download?
Sure. So that would be, essentially all of the user data was missed during that initial download.
How did you conclude or come to the opinion that data was missed on the initial download?
Sure. So reviewing the raw data, you can see that what we would expect to find, which would be things like contacts or from devices or device connections or time-stamped data, was not there in those initial downloads.
When you first looked at the data and you came to the conclusion that there was missing data, did you have a working theory on what you thought or how you thought the information was missing?
Sure. So I did have a working theory initially of why the data was missing.
And what was your initial theory?
Sure. So if, I'll reference kind of to the slide a little bit.
We can take that down if you'd like, Mr. Alisi.
Sure. So, sorry, can you repeat the question?
When you had your initial theory of data missing, what was it based on?
Sure. So the initial theory was based on two things. Either one of two things initially I thought could have happened, and that was a bad or partial read of the chips, or it could be that the data-bearing chip that we are looking for was overlooked and not downloaded.
When your first thoughts were that this was a partial read of chips, was there anything about the chips when you looked at them that you concluded or came to an opinion on?
Sure. So initially, when I was reviewing the data and reviewing the part numbers on the chips, we can see what, how much storage is on each chip. And that can kind of get complicated, but essentially what we're looking at is data stored as either bits or bytes. That is represented as a capital B or a small lowercase b. So initially, upon reviewing the data and with the assumption that a competent examiner would not miss a chip or a device or data-bearing chip on the board, I misinterpreted and wrote a lowercase or a capital B when I should have wrote a lowercase b in my notes, which led me to believe that there was a partial download of those initial chips.
Now, as a forensic analyst, do you rest on your initial impressions or do you go through a continued process?
No, so I do not. So just like the scientific method, if you have a working theory, you then review and research to either prove or disprove that theory.
And did you engage in that scientific process in working theory?
I did.
And how soon after you wrote the report did you realize there may be another source of the material?
Sure. So, I'll clarify a little bit. That initial was not a report; it was just a protocol that was proposed. But I believe that there was a supplemental protocol written within a week or two of the initial protocol.
And when you used the scientific method and studied the theory that you had, what did you decide or what did you learn?
Sure. So upon further review and research, I discovered that there was a SD card or a micro SD card that was on the circuit boards of one of the modules that was never looked at.
Now, you weren't present at the original process?
That is correct.
When you looked at the modules, those computer boards, did you notice anything about them that happened during the original process?
Sure. So I did notice during the chip off process, what you do to take these chips off is you apply heat to them. So that essentially liquefies the solder, which is a low temperature metal that connects the chips to the board and makes those connections so the board can communicate. And there was some damage caused from that initial chip off.
And again, why would you take the chips off a board if they're already attached? Why would you need to do that?
Sure. So when you don't have, typically if you think about downloading data from your cell phone, you have a USB port on your cell phone that you can easily plug that into a computer. That's not the case with vehicle modules. So you have to remove these chips from the board, and then you've got programmers or readers that will read the data from these chips.
Did you have a chance to study the boards that were already accessed during an earlier chip-off process before you got involved?
Yes, I did have an opportunity to study some photographs of the boards.
Could we have page 14, please, Ms. Gilman?
Any objection, Mr. Wilson?
No objection, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay, if we could turn to page 15. Tell us what this is, please.
Sure. So this is the infotainment module that you saw earlier. This is just two photographs during the disassembly process of taking that module apart.
Could you zoom in on the right photograph, Ms. Gilman? Okay, if that's the best we can do, that's fine right there. Could you share with us a little bit about what this is?
Sure. So this is how I received the modules when we took a secondary look at them. Essentially, this is if you see from the right photographs, there's many boards that are contained within this infotainment module. This specific board that we're looking at here on the right is the board where they removed chips from. What we're looking at is the circuit board itself, as well as two components that were previously removed during that initial download attempt.
So if you can't read the chips on the board, if you remove them, is there a tool that you can use to actually read the individual chips in isolation?
Yes, so there is tools, various tools that you can use to read those chips and read the data from those chips.
If we could have 16, please. Can you tell us what you see here?
Sure. So what you see here is two of the components that were initially removed from the board during that first download attempt. I've documented an additional chip that was still on the board that was not identified during that initial download on this side of the circuit board. And then I've got photographs matching the chip and where its placement was initially on the circuit board.
Could we have page 17, please? And what do we see there?
Sure. So this is some of the damage that occurred to the circuit board itself during the initial chip off download attempt.
Do you have a pointer on the stand?
I do, yes.
Could you show us with the left photograph, point out what you mean by damage?
Sure. So right here on the left part, you've got these two highlighted blocks. So what this is if you remember back to the last slide, the larger chip that we were looking at, this is directly underneath that. So when you're removing that larger chip, what you're doing is you're applying heat to it. If you apply too much heat during that chip off process, the underside of the board will actually heat up, and you'll have chips fall off of the underside of the board. So that's what's occurred here on the left side. On the right side, as you heat up these chips, if you're not careful as you pick them up off the board, you can displace other components, and that is what you see right here in this highlighted box here is a small passive component that has been displaced where it should be parallel.
What is the risk of damaging components when they're taking off the board during a chip off?
Sure. So the risk of that is causing damage that could be internally that we can't see. And if you want to put the chips back on the board and assemble everything back together, it may not work appropriately.
In addition to seeing the damage with your eyes on these photographs, do you look at data when you engage in the analysis whether or not you think data is missing?
Yes, I do.
Could we have page 6, please? Could you tell us what this is?
Sure. So this is just some examples of what user data would look like and what we're expecting to see when we look at the raw data from the chips that are removed from the board. So there's two ways to look at data, and one way is of looking at the file system, similar to the file system you would see on your computer when you store documents. Same thing exists in vehicle modules. There are instances, though, where you cannot rebuild the complete file system, and you've got to actually look at the raw data in hexadecimal format. So that hex data, the bottom photograph or screenshot, is what that would look like in hexadecimal format.
When you looked at the data that was provided during the original chip-off or process and was produced by Ms. Gaffney, were you able to, at this point, identify any date and time or power on or off information that you were looking for?
No, I was not.
You mentioned that you went beyond the original data from the testing and you discovered something on the board?
Yes, that's correct.
Could we have page 18, please? Tell us what you found.
Sure. So this is a micro SD card that I identified on the subject vehicle and later validated that existed on an exemplar vehicle as well.
Could you use the pointer?
Sure.
I know there's a red square, but I want you to describe for us what you saw and what that meant to you.
Sure. So if you look at this side of the circuit board, obviously this is a zoomed in view. But what you see is this kind of underneath the SD card is a silver casing. That is the slot that the SD card would go into, similar to the slot you would have on your computer. And again, what we're looking at is the SD card, just both sides, top and bottom.
You had mentioned earlier that when you looked at the data, you believed that there was data missing. When you found this SD card and discovered this, what did you conclude?
Sure. So at that point, I concluded that the data that we were missing was most likely stored on this SD card.
Did it appear whether or not this SD card had ever been removed from the board?
No, it did not.
Did you receive any information that this SD card was ever studied or downloaded?
No, I did not.
Could you just take this board and put it back in the car and use software to read it?
There are instances where you can do that. For this vehicle, though, we could not.
Why couldn't you?
Sure. So there are commercial forensic tools that are available for vehicle systems. One of those tools is referred to, or is called Burla. Burla is a company that writes hardware and software, or develops hardware and software that pulls data from vehicles in a user-friendly way, so that non-technical people can gain access to this data without having to go through the steps that we did in this case.
When you discovered this SD card and had your hypothesis that there may be data on it, did you have concerns about simply removing the SD card and trying to read it?
Yeah, so anytime you see an SD card on a vehicle module, in the past there's research and there's documentation of finding these SD cards. Most of the time they are what's called Command 42 locked. So what that means is there's a lock put in place. So if you take this SD card out, plug it into your computer is not going to recognize it. So the SD card is actually looking for a passcode from the vehicle itself to unlock it and allow access to the data.
What if you don't have that passcode?
Sure. So when you don't have that passcode, there are ways around that lock. Specifically, if we look at the left photo, you can see there's a lighter shaded black area on the SD card. What that is it's a protective covering that is covering some what's known as technological pads, and those pads allow access to reading the data and bypassing that lock.
Is gaining access to an SD card on a board like this a simple process?
It is not a simple process.
Are there a lot of advanced studies on it?
There are advanced studies on it, and it is a in-depth process to recover this data and interpret it.
Are there any concerns that you had about spoiling or destroying the data if you tried to access the SD card without a passcode?
No, not that I'm aware of. There's no documentation or research that suggests you would spoliate or lose data by bypassing that lock.
Were you concerned at all in trying to get the information from the SD card about the process of it?
Yes, I was.
Why?
To get data from this SD card, we suspected that the user data that we were expecting was on this card. So in order to validate that user data existed on this card, we processed and went through a set of testing and validation on an exemplar vehicle.
What's an exemplar vehicle mean?
Sure. So an exemplar vehicle is a 2021 Lexus LX570 that is as close to the same trim and features that the subject vehicle was.
We could take that down now, Ms. Gilman. Why did you want a similar but very separate vehicle to do testing before you tried to crack into the SD card?
Sure. So, it's kind of multiple reasons. First, to validate that the process that we're theorizing to recover data is viable. But also, this is a vehicle that there's no documentation on as far as, the data that is stored and the data, how it's recorded and what it, means. So as well as, being able to validate that process, we also wanted to do testing and create some of our own data and known data sets on a vehicle so that when we got the data, we were able to look at it and compare it to our known data sets, and we were able to validate and correctly interpret what that data means.
Mr. Brennan, why don't we take our break right now?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, folks, we'll take a 15, 20-minute break. All right, whenever you're ready, Mr. Brennan.
Mr. Burgess, when we left off, we were talking about an exemplar vehicle that you were using for tests and studies. If we could put up page 9, please, Ms. Gilman. Could you tell us what this is, Mr. Burgess?
Yes, so this is the photographs of the exemplar vehicle that we conducted testing on. So again, it's a 2021 Lexus LX 570. And the reasoning that we did this testing was, again, to validate that the user data that we were expecting to see was stored on that SD card. Additionally, in addition to that, we were also looking to create a exemplar data set, so a known data set, and we did that by connecting these cameras here. There's a camera here looking straight out. There's a camera here looking at the infotainment screen. What those cameras are doing is they're synced together, and they're recording timestamps as well as they're recording any interactions that we have with the vehicle. So us opening the doors, turning on the vehicle, turning off the vehicle, driving the vehicle, interacting with the infotainment system is all being documented. And then that way we can go back when we get the data off of the SD card and we can compare it to that documentation.
How closely were you trying to match the exemplar vehicle to the defendant's vehicle?
Obviously, as closely as we could get. If I recall correctly, this is almost a perfect match to the subject vehicle.
If we could turn to page 20, please. Can you tell us what this shows? And Ms. Gilman, if you could you focus in on the top gray and white line part, if you could? A little further out, if you could. We'd like to see all 3 rows if possible. And if not, we'll do it from a further view. Okay. Could you share with us what this slide represents, Mr.
Sure.
Burgess?
So this slide represents a comparison between the exemplar data and the data from the subject Lexus. In this comparison, we're looking at navigation system software. So that's going to be the infotainment system software. There's a number of different softwares running on this infotainment system for various functions. So you can see here there's a firmware version for the Wi-Fi functionality as well as the OS version, the audio, the DVD function, and I believe there's a section for the CD or disc version. So what we're looking at is we're looking at the software versions that are running on the exemplar. We're comparing that to the software versions that are running on the subject, and those match. So we would expect to see the user data to be stored in the same way.
Is it common that an exemplar vehicle will match the Focus vehicle exactly like this?
Yeah, so, I wouldn't say it's common or uncommon. I have seen it in the past. A lot of times with your newer vehicles, you'll probably notice some of them tend to update more often than others. For this one, it looks like the Lexus doesn't update quite as often. So we are able to see that the software versions are the same.
If we could take that down, please. And if you could remind us before we go into your findings in that SD card that was left behind. What was the most important thing you were looking for as far as data on that SD card?
Sure. So the most important thing we're looking for is time-stamped data specifically related to power on or ignition on events.
If you were to find time-stamped data for power on, power off ignition events, how would you use that? What would you use that in unison or comparison with the information that you already had?
Sure. So we would use that in comparison with provided surveillance videos. to compare and see how accurate those timestamps are and how consistent they are, specifically on the night of January, or the morning of January 29th.
When you analyzed the SD card, did you get viable information?
Yes, we did.
What information did you get?
So we've got a couple different data types. We got contact lists from some of the connected devices, as well as serial numbers and phone numbers associated with the connected devices, call logs, and then power on and power off events.
Was your focus on one particular aspect of that data?
Primarily, the focus was on the power on and off events.
And did you find information regarding power and power off events that could date and time those?
Yes, we did.
If we could have number 29, please. 30. Can you share with us what you found?
Sure. So this is some screenshots from our exemplar testing. So again, these are from those cameras that I pointed out earlier. What we see when we go back and review this camera footage is we see when I press the ignition on button, there is actually a logo that appears on the infotainment screen as it's booting up. That time that logo appears on the screen is associated with a time that we see in the raw data, and that's in the hexadecimal data that is very small, so it's kind of hard to see. But essentially what you have is you've got a date and you've got a time in UTC, and then you've got a identifier that suggests that the vehicle has been powered on. So we've got 4 of these tests that we can kind of compare back to and determine that this is the time that the infotainment system powers on and that first logo screen appears. And then through testing, we can identify that that is approximately ignition on is approximately 3 seconds before that timestamp.
So do I understand if you press the button to start the vehicle, there's a 3-second delay before the actual vehicle starts?
Correct. So not the actual vehicle starting. So you press the ignition on button, there's a 3-second delay in when the infotainment system powers on.
Is there any way, Ms. Gilman, to focus in on one of those 2 photos? Can you tell us what this information is?
Sure. So this is those camera angles. And what you see is I'm pressing the ignition on at this time. In that second photo on the right, you'll see that this is specifically approximately 3 seconds after I press that ignition on, and you see the Lexus logo appearing on the infotainment module.
Let me ask you something about the clocks while we're here. You see a local time on there?
Yes, I do.
Is that local time measured by a particular clock system?
Sure. So that's measured by our reference equipment. So we're using what's called VBox equipment to capture these videos. So here, that local time is actually UTC time. So it's not actually local time for this area. So that could be a little, that could be an error in how that's reporting. But essentially what we're seeing is the infotainment system is powering on at that exact time of 21:48:08.
And this was for power on. Can we have number 31, please? How's this different than the one we just looked at?
Sure. So this is power off. So this is myself pressing the ignition to power off the vehicle. And what we see at this exact time when you power off and press the ignition button, the screen on the infotainment system becomes blank, and associated with that, it powers off, and you see a log within the raw data that indicates that.
You mentioned that you found power on, power off information. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So through this testing, what we were able to do is see that there are time-stamped power on and off events for when the infotainment system is recording a power on and power off. And then we validated that with the exemplar testing.
Ultimately, were you able to use that power on, power off timestamp information to identify the times of the later two events, the tech stream events, the three-point turn and the backing maneuver?
Yes, in combination with other data, we were able to determine that.
Did you test the power on, power off data?
Yes, we did.
Could we have number 32, please? Can you tell us what this is?
Sure. So this is the first power on event after 12 o'clock on January 29th. That power event is happening at 12:36 up here in the top. And the vehicle is powered on and it's not powered off until 12:42:08.
Is there any power on, power off events in between those two times?
No, there's not.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that whether or not the first power on event for that night, January 29, 2022, was 12:36 a.m.?
Yes.
Your Honor.
I'll sustain it at this point.
Do you have an opinion as to the first power on event of that Lexus on January 29, 2022?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Sustained at this time.
When you studied the information from the data, does this slide reflect the information that you studied?
Yes, it does.
Were you able to determine from your data study the time that was registered of when that Lexus was turned on for the first time on January 29, 2022?
Yes, I was.
How were you able to do that?
Sure. So through our exemplar testing and determining that those timestamps are accurate to when the vehicle was powered on, we are able to say that this power on event is the first power on event of January 29th after 12 a.m.
And based on your study of the exemplar and the data from the SD card, did you arrive at an opinion as to the time of the first power on event of that Lexus vehicle on January 29, 2022?
Yes, I did.
Is your opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, it is.
And what is your opinion?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'll see you at sidebar.
Mr. Burgess, could you explain for us how you can identify the power on event from the data that you discovered on that SD card that was left behind?
Sure. So through our exemplar testing, we can identify a power on event, which is depicting the time the logo on the infotainment system comes on, and then the time the infotainment system goes blank. So that is representing a power off event. And then we can reference that back to the ignition on, which occurs approximately 3 seconds before the power on, the infotainment power on event.
Is this a methodology that is used in your standard of practice?
Yes, it is.
And have you used this type of methodology before?
Yes, I have.
Is it a methodology that is regularly accepted in this type of analysis?
Yes, so this is a methodology that is regularly accepted in the digital forensics community, and it is a process of testing and then validating.
How does that process further validate the accuracy of the times that you are registering and finding?
Sure. So through that testing, we are able to validate that accuracy. And through that testing, we've got 4 tests that represent a power on event and 2 tests that represent a power off event. In addition to that, we are comparing that data to surveillance video with timestamps as well to show the consistency.
When you engaged in your testing, you said there was 4 test runs or examples. Did you analyze it to see how, in fact, accurate it was?
Yes, I did.
And how accurate was it?
It was accurate to the second compared to our reference clock.
And when you actually take the data from that SD card, how do you interpret it? How do you get it from a piece of plastic with metal on it to actual numbers and data?
Sure. So the process of that, again, is we're making connection to those technological pads on the SD card, and we're pulling that raw data. Once we have that raw data, there's a few processes we have to go through to make that raw data interpretable. So those processes are what's called XOR scrambling. So when data is stored on an SD card, there are 2 components to the SD card. There is what's called the NAND component, and then there's a controller component. The controller component is where that, if you remember, that command 42 lock is located in that controller component. So what we're doing is we're bypassing that controller, we're accessing that NAND, and then we're using forensic software to determine and interpret the XOR scrambling that is put in place on that NAND so that we can take that scrambled data and be able to read it and interpret it, as well as what's called error correction code. So NAND devices are not, they're not great at keeping voltages accurate like they should, and that's just based on how the architecture and how the NAND components are manufactured. So what the manufacturers have done is they've put in place error correction code to correct any bit errors within that data. So what we've done is we've identified the error correction code and the XOR scrambling using software known as Resolute. That software, again, is hardware and software that we use to access that data and process it and interpret it. From there, we can take that data and we can review it in that hexadecimal format.
And based on that methodology and that process and that study, were you able to extract the data from the SD card and identify the first power on event of the defendant's Lexus on January 29th, 2022 to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, I was.
And do you have an opinion about what time that Lexus, the defendant's Lexus, was powered on December 29th, 2022 for the first time?
Yes, that would be approximately 12/12/36.
Is that to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, it is.
On your chalk on the screen, does the power on event, is that the same as your interpretation?
Yes, it is.
The 12/12/36 a.m. time, what time clock is that based on?
Sure, so that's based on the internal clock in the Lexus.
The clock in the Lexus, is that a universal time, or do clocks on different devices run differently?
Sure. So it's not a universal time. Clocks on different devices run differently. So if you've ever noticed that your microwave clock is not running in sync with your iPhone, the same thing is occurring here. Even though the Lexus clock is communicating back and forth with the GPS satellites and other things, the clock is still not synchronized perfectly. So you would not expect this clock to match up perfect with other devices.
When you're considering two very different or separate devices, if the time is different, what would that be called?
Sure. So that would be called what's called a clock variance.
I want to get into that later, but I want to finish what we have in front of us now.
Sure.
In addition to identifying the first power-on event of January 29, 2022, of the defendant's Lexus at 12/12/36, were you able to identify the first power-off event of that same Lexus for January 29, 2022?
Yes, I was, and that was at 12:42:08 approximately.
Did you use the same methodology and vetting that you did in testing that you did with the power-on event?
Yes, I did.
And do you have an opinion if that time is accurate to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
So that opinion is that time is reliable to the second as far as the Lexus clock is concerned.
What is the graph on the bottom showing us?
Sure. So the graph is just a graphical representation of the same data, representing the power on event on a timeline at 12/12/36 and the power off event at approximately 12:42:08.
When you're looking at times, power on and power off events to date and time it, are you obtaining that information independent of other outside information?
Yes, I am.
Is the data simply the data, or does something affect it?
Sure. So no, the data is simply the data. So when we get the data, we can compare it to outside sources or external sources to verify that it's consistent with other sources. But the data does not depend on any outside sources.
Do you oftentimes use outside sources to vet or test the data, even though it's totally separate concept?
Yes, I do.
After this power on, power off event, when you studied the data from the SD card using the same methodology and technique, did you find any other subsequent power on and power off events for the defendant's Lexus on January 29, 2022 after this event?
Yes, I did.
Could we have slide 33, please? Mr. Burgess, can you tell us what the next event is that you found in the data?
Sure. So the next power on event occurs at 5:07:46. That's this top timestamp here. The infotainment system records a power off event after that at 5:46:20. And what we have here is we've got surveillance video that was provided that depicts the approximate time range that those two events happen. So these videos do not capture the actual power on or power off event, but they occur around the same time frame and they are consistent with one another.
The power on event time that you've listed as 5:07:46. Where does that time come from?
So that time is coming from the internal Lexus clock.
And based on the data from the Lexus clock, do you have an opinion as to the accuracy of that time of 5:07:46 a.m. as it relates to the Lexus clock?
Yes, I do.
And what's your opinion?
So compared to the Lexus clock, that time is accurate to the second.
The videos you have, are those timed from the same Lexus clock or a different source?
No, so those timestamps of the videos are coming from external sources. In the example of these videos, I believe that is a Ring camera.
Why would you try to vet the time stamp that you've identified to the second from the Lexus clock with another item, including a video that uses a different clock?
Sure. So that further validates that those timestamps are accurate and they're consistent with timestamps we're seeing from other devices.
Can there be a variance with other devices?
There can be a variance.
If there's a variance, could that still corroborate or support the original timestamp from the Lexus clock?
Yes. So even with a variance, those timestamps can still be consistent with one another.
And on the two photographs, are those videos or photographs?
Those are videos.
What is the purpose of including a video?
Sure. So the purpose of including the video is just to depict that the video does not actually capture the power on or power off event. But again, it is around the same time frame that the power on and power off event occur.
Ms. Gilman, are you able to play the video to the left? Thank you. What about that video vets or corroborates the 5:07:46 Lexus time on the power on event?
Objection, Your Honor.
A little bit more before you get to that, Mr. Brown.
Okay. Did you use the video that we just saw in an attempt to vet or corroborate the timestamp for the power on event on the Lexus?
Yes, I did.
How did you do that?
Sure. So looking at the start timestamp on the video, we can see that the video starts at approximately 5:07:58. Keeping in mind this timestamp is coming from the camera or the Ring video, the Ring camera itself. And when we look at the power on event, we see that it occurs at 5:07:46. So although we don't see the actual time of the power on event, that is consistent with what we would expect.
What does the video on the right help us do?
So video on the right helps us do the same thing. So when we look at the power off event, that occurs at 5:46:20. Again, when we look at the Ring video on the right, that start timestamp of that video is 5:46:29. So again, we missed the power off portion of when that occurs, but that is consistent, again, with what we would expect.
Could we play the video on the right? If you can enlarge, that would be helpful. If not, if you could stop the video, please. Mr. Burgess, you see the lights are on that vehicle?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Can you tell if the vehicle's on or off at that point?
Sure. So I cannot tell if the vehicle is on or off at that point. Typically, when you power off a Lexus or a modern vehicle, the lights will stay on for some portion of time afterwards. But again, that is consistent with the timestamp from the power off event.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the accuracy of the power on and power off events as they pertain to the Lexus clock?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
And that is that those timestamps are accurate to the second.
Did you further follow the data to see if there was any other power on, power off events relative to the Lexus for January 29, 2022?
Yes, I did.
Could you take us to Exhibit 34, please? What is this, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So this is the next time that the vehicle is powered on and subsequently powered off. That power on event occurs at 12:35:01. The power off event occurs at 2:12:01. And then this video is a video from alarm.com surveillance that depicts the vehicle pulling into a driveway and shutting off. So when we look at the video and we watch the video, you can actually see at 2:12:01 in the video timestamp that the windshield wipers stop moving and the vehicle's suspension begins to lower, indicating that the ignition button has been pressed.
Let's start with the power on event. Was there any video available to show the power on event at 12:35:01?
There is no video available that I'm aware of.
On the last slide, you had the power off event at 5:46:20 a.m.
Correct.
Was there any other power on, power off events between 5:46:20 a.m. and this event here?
No, there was not.
Did you try to obtain any collateral or corroborative video or evidence relative to the power on event of 12:35:01?
I did request or make a request to see if there was any video available, and as far as I'm aware, there was not.
Regarding the power on event, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the accuracy of the power on event as it relates to the Lexus clock on the system?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
That is that power on event is accurate to the second in reference to the Lexus clock.
12:35:01 p.m.?
Correct.
And do you have an opinion as to the power off event to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the accuracy from the data you recovered from the SD card?
Yes, I do. And that power off event, again, occurred at approximately 2:12:01, according to the Lexus clock.
I don't know if you can enlarge the video, Ms. Gilman, but if you can, and if not, could you play anyways? Thank you. And could you explain for us the graph on the bottom of that exhibit? Or,
Sure.
Pardon me, of that diagram.
Sure. So that graph, again, is just a timeline graphical representation of when that power off event occurred and when the power on event occurred and when the power off event occurred at 12:35:01 and 2:12:01.
Based on the data you analyzed from the SD card, was there any further power on and power off events on January 29, 2022 after this 12:35:01 to 2:12:01 event?
Yes, there was.
Could you display for us page 35, Ms. Gilman? And what is this, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So this is the next power on event that is recorded within the system. And that power on event occurs approximately 4:11:46, and the power off event occurs at 4:12:56. The video we see is that same alarm.com surveillance video. The start timestamp of that video is 4:12:03. So again, we don't see the actual power on and off event within the video, but it is consistent with what we would expect as the power on event occurring at 4:11:46, and then the video starting, and we see the car backing up at 4:12:03.
Would the alarm.com be using a different clock than that of the Lexus?
It would be, yes.
And based on your methodology in vetting and testing in view of the data on the SD card, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the time of this power on event?
Yes, so that power on event would be 4:11:46.
And do you have an opinion as to the time of the power off event related to this diagram?
Yes, that would be 4/12/56.
Is that opinion as well to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, it is.
Is that a photograph or a video?
That is also a video.
Ms. Gilman, could you help us? Thank you. And similarly, does the graph give a general idea of the time?
Yes, so similarly, the graph is a timeline representation of the power on and power off event.
Mr. Burgess, was there an additional power on, power off event after the power off event at 4/12/56 p.m. at the Dighton residence?
Yes, there was.
Ms. Gilman, could you show us number 36, please? Mr. Burgess, could you take us through this one?
Sure. So this is the next power off or power on event that occurs, and that power on event occurs at 5:34:51 p.m. The power off event occurs at 5:36:42. Again, the video that is associated with this does not show the power on or the power off event, but it shows the time just before the vehicle is arriving to this location on a tow truck, and that would be consistent with the vehicle then being powered off and backed off of the tow truck at that time.
And based on your analysis of the data, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty what time this power on event took place?
Yes, and that time would be 5:34:51.
And that's according to the internal Lexus clock?
Yes, it is.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty when this vehicle was then powered off?
Yes, and that would be 5:36:42.
Again, pursuant to the Lexus clock.
Correct.
After this event at 5:34:51 p.m. to 5:36:42 p.m., when you studied the data, were there any other power on or power off events for this Lexus vehicle on January 29, 2022?
Not that I studied after this event.
Could you take that down, please? Now, we touched on an issue earlier. I want you to give your opinions and explain to the jury. You mentioned the word variance between different items. I don't think you used the word items. You said something else.
Sure. So that's going to be the clock variance between different devices. So in this instance, what we're referring to is the difference in the clocks of the Lexus module and an iPhone. So we would not expect those clocks to be perfectly synced. Typically what we see, and is what is generally accepted, is a clock variance of up to 60 seconds. And that is because when you think about when you're looking at your radio and you're looking at the clock, it's representing to you the hours and the minutes. It's not representing the seconds. So again, it's accurate. Its function is to be accurate to the minute, but its function is not to be accurate to the second.
Is a variance between different devices an accepted concept in your community?
Yes, it is an accepted concept in my community.
When you were looking for power on, power off information from the data on the SD card, what clock would that information, that time, be dependent on?
Sure. So that's going to be dependent on the Lexus clock. That Lexus clock is continuously running. but it also syncs up with GPS systems to update the clock on occasion. We do not know how frequent that activity occurs because that is proprietary to the manufacturer themselves.
To bring us back, when you started this case, there were two important text stream events.
Correct. There were two text stream events.
Remind us what those were.
Sure. So one is going to be associated with a three-point turn, and the other is going to be associated with a backing maneuver.
In those two text stream events, are they related in any way to the running clock that is on the text stream data?
Sure. So when we think back, the text stream events have that running clock from ignition on, and because we know the power on events from the infotainment module, we can reconcile when those time counts occurred.
If there's information about timing from text stream data on the Lexus, what would you have to do if you took a separate device like an iPhone and you wanted to reconcile the variance?
Sure. So if we want to reconcile the variance, what we would need is we would need an event that occurs that both clocks record. So for instance, if you've got two cameras that are recording you jumping up and down, you would take your motion of jumping up and down or your event of jumping up and down, and you would use that event to sync the clocks of those two cameras. So essentially, we're doing the same thing with the Lexus clock and the iPhone clock.
When you did your analysis during this case, initially, did you have any interest in trying to reconcile those clocks?
No, I did not.
Why not?
Because that is generally accepted that the clock variance is up to 60 seconds. And while reviewing the power on and off events and comparing that to the surveillance videos that were provided, that was consistent with what we would have expected.
Did something compel you to further your study and compare the Lexus clock information on those two text stream events, the three-point turn and the backing maneuver, to a different device?
Yes, there was a claim of attempting to synchronize those two clocks that I believed was potentially misleading.
So based on reviewing that information and coming to that conclusion, did you on your own do any further study about the difference in clocks and attempt to synchronize them?
Yes, I did.
You said that you can synchronize if you have more than one device identifying a particular time. What did you mean by that?
Sure. So if we've got two devices that are recording a similar event, so let's say, for instance, a three-point turn, if that is recorded with an iPhone, with the iPhone's clock, we can compare that event to the time that that event occurs and is recorded by the Lexus.
Were you aware of any device other than the Lexus recording that three-point turn?
Yes, I was.
What were you aware of?
That would be an iPhone from Mr. O'Keefe.
Did you have data and information from Mr. O'Keefe's phone some time ago?
I did have partial location data from Mr. O'Keefe's iPhone.
Did you do something with his iPhone data as it relates to the Lexus clock on those two events, the three-point turn and the backing maneuver?
I did on the three-point turn, yes, and the backing maneuver.
Tell us what you did.
Sure. So I looked at when the three-point turn occurred within the iPhone data and the location data in reference to that clock, and then looked at the same three-point turn event as it was recorded from the text stream and the Lexus clock.
At some point, did you have enough data to make that full analysis?
Yes, I did.
Now, as a general concept, before we get to the three-point turn in detail, I want to turn to page 39 of your PowerPoint. I'm sorry, if you could turn to page 38, please. Okay. Can you explain to us the concept of synchronizing clocks?
Sure. So this is kind of a graphical representation of how to synchronize a clock. So essentially, like I said, we're taking a event that occurs. In this instance, it's a three-point turn. We have data where that three-point turn is recorded within an iPhone, and we have data where that three-point turn is recorded within the Lexus. Those events have clocks associated with them. So in order to reconcile the difference in those clocks, we are comparing the clock times for the event from each device and moving or adjusting the clock for one compared to the other.
In addition to specializing in data and computers and cars, you also mentioned that you specialize in mobile phones.
Yes, I do.
Did you use your experience in your training and your education to analyze the iPhone data from Mr. O'Keefe's phone as it related to the information from the Lexus vehicle?
Objection, Your Honor.
Can you answer that, yes or no?
Yes.
Just answer yes or no.
Yes,
You did?
I did.
Okay. Did you see what type of information was being stored on Mr. O'Keefe's cell phone as far as location data?
Objection, Your Honor.
Oh, no, that.
Yes, I did. In reference to location data, Mr. O'Keefe's iPhone is recording timestamps, GPS position, speed, and heading. So heading is going to be the direction that the iPhone is facing.
Was there any particular application that you were aware of that he was using?
Yes, as far as I'm aware, he was using the Waze app for navigation.
Could we have number 39, please? Could you tell us what this shows, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So specifically what we're looking at within the location data is a 2-minute window. So that 2-minute window we see here graphically plotted on a map. And we see, it's hard to tell, but you can see a white dot, which is the center of a radius for a GPS position. The orange circles are the horizontal accuracy for each one of those positions. And then down here you can see a black line that is coming off of each GPS position that represents the heading or the direction that the iPhone is facing.
You mentioned you had some materials from Mr. Whiffen. Did you ever see any materials from Mr. Whiffen regarding location data that was acquired through the application Waze?
Yes, I did see a report by Mr. Whiffen.
Did you rely on his report, or did you independently, on your own, test the location information?
Sure. So I independently, on my own, looked at the location data from Mr. O'Keefe's phone.
This diagram that we see with all the points on it, is this developed from your own independent view and review of Mr. O'Keefe's location data?
It is.
To the top left is a round circle. What does that indicate?
Sure. So top left. So yeah. So that's going to be, again, the GPS coordinate beginning for this 2-minute interval that we're looking at. The orange circle is going to be the horizontal accuracy for that GPS point.
And then bring us down and up to the left. There seems to be a bigger circle on the top.
Sure. So as we come down, believe what is Cedar Crest and go up Cedar Crest, we have a position where the course heading of the iPhone changes, the speed lowers, and we have a lot more GPS points in a centralized location. So that's why you see that overlapping circles in that location.
When you're following and analyzing Mr. O'Keefe's location information, does this in any way relate to the first of those two text stream events that you originally were focused on?
It does relate to the first text stream event, which identifies a 3-point turn.
And again, although you're not an accident reconstructionist, do you know if there's data that was captured regarding this 3-point turn as far as an event?
Yes, I'm aware of data that was captured during that 3-point turn event.
If we could turn to page 40, please. I want you to explain to us how this chart works. What does a point mean?
Sure. So when we were initially provided the location data. Again, we were provided a partial view or a partial data set of that location data. And within that Excel spreadsheet that data was provided in, it was identified as GPS points. So what we've got here is we've got the partial data along with the full data set that I was provided later on. So we've got a couple columns here. So we've got point, which is GPS point from that partial initial data set that I was provided. We've got timestamps. So these timestamps are every second. With every second, there is a latitude and a longitude recorded, as well as a horizontal accuracy, a speed, and again, a course heading.
When you looked at data point 154, is there a time ascribed to that?
There is a time described to that as 12:23:58.
Before you did this more in-depth analysis, were you relying on anything beyond point 154, that one line?
No, so that was the only thing that was being relied on at that time.
Why?
Because, again, we were initially provided a partial data set of the location.
And why didn't you seek earlier on to break this down with more specificity?
Again, because the generally accepted clock variance is up to 60 seconds, and that data was consistent with everything else we were seeing, so there was no need to look any further.
And what compelled you again to look further?
A claim of misinterpreting and a misleading calculation trying to adjust these clocks.
Were you given a report?
I was not given a report. I was giving a PowerPoint presentation.
I see. When you decided to delve deeper into this, was that on your own initiative or were you requested to do it?
That was on my own initiative.
Now, rather than simply relying on point 154, what does breaking it down with all of the times and numbers between the green and orange do for your analysis?
Sure. So breaking it down, we can see between the green. So the green highlighted in green is position or timestamp 12:23:59. What we see happening before that time is the speed is pretty consistent between 15 and 8 miles per hour. The speed starts to drop at that point. And if we look at the course heading, we can see that the course heading before that time is pretty consistent as well, between 339 and 348. So that is, at position or at time 12:23:59, the speed drops and the course heading changes from, approximately 360, so straight north, to 284, which is in a northwesternly direction. After that time of 12:23:59, the speed recorded is 0. The course heading is 352. And at time 12:24:07, you see the speed pick back up, and the course heading is around 179 degrees. So that's going to be in a southern direction. So based on this information, we can tell that the vehicle between 12:23:59 and 12:24:07 made a 3-point turn maneuver, changing from the northern direction of heading to the southern direction.
Is this data generated from Mr. O'Keefe's phone or from the Lexus?
Sure. So this data is generated from Mr. O'Keefe's phone.
Where you initially relied on 154 as a timestamp to identify the time and location of the car at a later point, does this give you more of a benefit breaking it down?
This does give you more of a benefit breaking it down.
The zeros and the speed, what does that indicate to you as far as the data relative to the portion of the 3-point turn?
Sure. So it doesn't necessarily mean the vehicle is at 0 miles per hour. Again, if you look at the horizontal accuracies, we've got anywhere between 16 and 29 feet. So that's the range in the GPS and what it's seeing. So if the car is, slightly moving or moving like you would expect during a 3-point turn, you would expect to see that speed at, 0 miles per hour.
Did you develop a photograph with some detail to explain this in more of a picture format?
Yes, I did make a graphical representation of this.
If we could have 41, please. Could you break this down for us, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So this is, again, a zoomed-in version of the map that we showed earlier. And what we've done is we've cleaned out or just removed, for the sake of simplicity, the other points leading north to this point and the points leading south. Those are going to be those 0 mile per hour indications. So what we're looking at is the heading change and that speed change, which occurs at 12:23:59. And you can see the heading change from the black arrow leading off of the center radius of the GPS position. And then at 12:24:07, you see the heading change to a southern direction, and then the other GPS points are consistent with the vehicle moving southbound on Cedar Crest.
So the claim that you analyzed, did that actually compel you to analyze and identify a more accurate variance than you originally had?
It did.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty what the variance is between the clock on the defendant's Lexus on January 29, 2022 and Mr. O'Keefe's cell phone on January 29, 2022?
Yes, I do.
And to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, what is that variance?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. Need a little more, Mr. Brennan.
Okay. After you studied timestamp 154, what did that help you do? What did you learn from that?
Sure. So after studying timestamp GPS point 154 and these further GPS positions, we're able to identify the approximate, time that the 3-point turn occurred according to Mr. O'Keefe's iPhone data. So now we've got that event of when that 3-point turn occurred. Now we can compare that to the 3-point turn from the tech stream data and that running clock. Again, what we're doing is taking the power on event at 12:12:36 and adding the time count from the tech stream data to come up with the time of 12:23:38 in the tech stream data. So the tech stream data indicates a 3-point turn ended or a trigger event, a tech stream event ended at approximately 12:23:38. The iPhone indicates that a 3-point turn occurred between 12:23:59 and 12:24:07. So since we've got that shared event between the two devices, we can reconcile any type of clock variance. So adjusting the Lexus clock to the iPhone clock, we can calculate that clock variance.
Is this a methodology that is commonly used in your practice?
It is.
Is it commonly used in the scientific community which you're part of?
It is.
Are there scholarly papers about this type of methodology in comparison of synchronizing clocks?
There are.
One of the papers you wrote, did that have anything to do with synchronization of clocks?
It did not have anything to do with synchronization of clocks, but it was relative to how accurate the timestamps are of events from iPhones.
And that was one of your peer-reviewed papers?
Yes, it was.
And are there scholarly journals and studies on the synchronization of clocks?
There are, yes.
Did you use that methodology in your analysis to come to arrive at an opinion about the time variance between the defendant's Lexus and Mr. O'Keefe's phone?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
The clock variance is between 21 and 29 seconds.
If we could have number 42, please. What is this, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So this is, if we think back to the last slide, we've identified the 3-point turn event in both the data sets. So now if we want to adjust one clock to the other, we can do that. And doing that, we've identified that the variance is between 21 and 29 seconds. So we would need to adjust the Lexus clock forward by 21 to 29 seconds to synchronize it with the iPhone data. So in doing that, the end of text stream event 1162.1 goes from 12:23:38 to 12:23 between 12:23:59 and 12:24:07.
These two clocks, one on the left being the Lexus clock that reads 12:23:38 a.m., and the other clock on Mr. O'Keefe's iPhone has a different time, 12:23:59 to 12:24:07. Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty if these two clocks pertain to an event that's happening at the same time or a different time?
Yes. So these two clocks are, we are synchronizing these clocks to an event that is happening at the same time.
This is relative to the first text stream event, the three-point turn. You said there was a second text stream event that you were analyzing.
Correct. There is a second text stream event.
And what is that second text stream event?
That second text stream event is a backing up maneuver.
Are you familiar with the time frame on the Lexus clock relative to that second text stream event?
Yes, I am.
And what is that time frame?
So it is approximately 19 minutes from the ignition on.
And do you know what time that is on the Lexus clock?
Yes, I do.
With the court's permission?
Yes.
So that is going to be 12:31:43 is going to be the end of that text stream event.
That text stream event, by the way, when it captures data, what window of data does it capture when there's a text stream event or a triggering event?
Sure. So when the trigger occurs, it captures data 5 seconds before and 5 seconds after the trigger.
What if the event is less than 10 seconds?
So if it's less than 10 seconds, it would capture the entire event. If it's more than 10 seconds, it would only capture a partial snapshot of that event.
And so when you talk about the data for the backing event, is that the 10-second window you're speaking of?
Yes, that is that 10-second window.
Does that have anything to do with defining the length of the actual event?
No, it does not.
Okay. When you looked at the time from the Lexus clock regarding that backing event, did you do an analysis of John O'Keefe's phone considering the variance that you identified?
Yes, I did. So I applied the same variance to that second text stream event.
When you apply that variance between the Lexus clock and Mr. O'Keefe's phone, what is the, could I turn to 43, please? What is the time of that event if we're referring to Mr. O'Keefe's phone?
Sure. So the time of that event with the clock variance adjusted is 12:32:04 to between 12:32:04 and 12:32:12.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the accuracy of that time from Mr. O'Keefe's phone considering the variance?
Yes, I do.
And what is your opinion?
And the opinion is that the second text stream event ends between 12:32:04 and 12:32:12.
When you say text stream event, that's the 10-second window?
Correct. That's the 10-second window.
Does that necessarily include the entire event?
No, it does not.
The graph on the bottom, what does that show us? It looks a little bit overwritten.
Yeah, so that graph is a timeline representation of the text stream event ending, being adjusted with the 12:32:04 to 12:32:12 in comparison with the last lock event that is recorded by Mr. O'Keefe's phone at 12:32:09.
Your analysis relative to the data that you obtained from the SD card, is your analysis and opinions separate from the other information you looked at that corroborated or supported your analysis?
Yes, they are.
I have no further questions.
Lights, please. That's as good as they can be, huh? One's burnt out. I'll see Councilor Temple.